The processing center was supposed to be a routine operation by the spring of 1945, filled with the dull sounds of shuffling boots, defeated murmurs, and the scratching of pens on registration papers. Hundreds of surrendered German soldiers stood in long, exhausted lines, their uniforms caked in the gray mud of the collapsing Third Reich. Military police moved through the columns, checking papers and stripping the prisoners of concealed weapons and unauthorized rations. When General George S. Patton arrived at the outer wire to inspect the intake procedures, the yard was operating with the mechanical efficiency of an army that knew the war was ending. He walked past the enlisted men without pausing, his eyes scanning the posture and discipline of the captured troops, until he reached the designated enclosure where the SS officers were being processed separately. The air in this section was different, heavier with a defiant silence, as men who had once considered themselves the elite of Europe now stood behind barbed wire, still clinging to the remnants of their former authority. Patton was inspecting the registration tables when a metallic clinking sound broke the rhythm of the yard. It was not the heavy clank of equipment or the rattle of canteens, but the distinct, lightweight chime of small chains and stamped steel. Patton stopped walking, his gaze locked onto a tall SS guard standing near the front of the line, whose uniform was immaculate despite the conditions of the camp. But it was not the pristine uniform that caught Patton's eye. Hanging around the neck of the SS guard, draped casually over his dark collar like a twisted garland of victory, was a thick necklace made entirely of metal. Dozens of pieces of metal. As Patton stepped closer, the MPs stationed at the tables stopped writing. The low murmur of the processing center faded into a sudden, suffocating silence. The entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Patton did not blink as he closed the distance between himself and the prisoner. The objects around the guard's neck were not German medals. They were not captured insignia. They were American dog tags, 50 of them stained with the mud and blood of the battlefields where they had been taken, resting against the chest of a man who viewed the lives of fallen Americans as nothing more than personal trophies. The SS guard stood tall, his chin raised slightly, showing no sign of fear or remorse, as the American general stared at the metal tags belonging to 50 sons, brothers, and husbands who would never return home. The silence in the processing center grew heavy, thick with a tension that threatened to snap, as every American soldier in the yard waited to see what Patton would do next. The SS guard, caught in the sudden, suffocating silence of the yard, felt the weight of Patton's gaze more heavily than the rifle slung over his shoulder. He attempted to maintain his posture, but the general's presence, an aura of raw, unfiltered authority, seemed to drain the oxygen from the air around him. The other SS prisoners, who had been standing with a practiced air of superiority, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the guard and the man who was currently holding their fate in his hands. Patton did not move, but the air around him crackled with a tension that was physically palpable. He was not just a high-ranking officer in a decorated uniform. He was a force of nature that had rolled across Europe, and at this moment, the entire yard understood that he was a man who did not tolerate the desecration of the fallen. "I asked you a question, soldier," Patton repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried to the back rows of the German POWs standing in the mud. The interpreter, now sweating despite the cool spring temperature, turned back to the guard. He whispered the general's ultimatum, but he didn't need to. The guard could read the death sentence in Patton's eyes. The SS man's hands, which had been resting confidently on his belt, now trembled slightly. The arrogance that had fueled his decision to wear the tags, a twisted desire to provoke the Americans, to show them he had conquered their brothers in arms, began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, sharp realization that he had miscalculated. He was no longer a soldier in the field. He was a prisoner in a cage, and the man holding the key had no interest in his political delusions. Patton's gaze dropped from the guard's face to the necklace again. He counted the tags with his eyes, one by one, imagining the homes they had come from and the letters their mothers would receive, the ones that read "missing in action" or "killed in the line of duty." He thought of the training, the camaraderie, and the final, lonely moments those boys had faced in the snow. The silence of the yard was broken only by the distant sound of a truck engine idling near the infirmary. Patton didn't look at the other prisoners. He didn't look at his own staff. He was locked in a private confrontation with a man who represented everything he had fought to destroy. Not just an ideology, but the utter absence of humanity. "Take them off," Patton commanded, not as a request, but as an absolute reality that was about to occur. He turned slightly, looking at the American MP who had stepped forward, readying his grip on his baton. "And do not let them touch the dirt," Patton added, his voice cold. "Those men deserve better than the mud of this camp." The SS guard's face turned ashen. He reached up, his fingers fumbling with the clasp at the back of his neck, the metal clinking softly one last time. As the string of dog tags fell away, the guard's posture crumbled. The stolen trophies, the source of his pride and his arrogance, were now nothing more than cold steel in the hands of the American soldier. And the SS man stood there, stripped of the only thing that had made him feel like a conqueror in his defeat. The guard's fingers, previously so steady as he held his rifle, stumbled over the clasp. It was a crude, heavy link, worn smooth by the friction of his own skin. He pulled at it, his face flushing deep red under the watchful gaze of hundreds of prisoners. When the clasp finally gave way, the string of metal rattled, a sickening, hollow sound that seemed to echo across the entire compound. The SS guard didn't drop it. He held it for a brief, defiant moment, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of a tag that belonged to a man he had killed months ago. Patton's eyes narrowed. He didn't wait for the guard to hand it over. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dirt, and snatched the necklace from the guard's hand with the speed of a striking cobra. The movement caused the guard to stumble backward, nearly tripping. Patton stood still, holding the heavy loop of chains and tags. He raised it, watching the sunlight glint off the stamped steel, the names and serial numbers of boys who would never go home, now reduced to a collection of scrap metal for a butcher to parade. Patton's face was a mask of cold fury, but as he ran his thumb over the first tag, his expression shifted into something more complex, a profound, heavy sorrow. He could read the names. They were boys whose units had been attached to his army. He looked at the SS guard, who was now trembling visibly, and the general's voice dropped to a whisper that was deadlier than a shout. "You think you're a soldier?" Patton asked, the question hanging in the air like a blade. "You're not a soldier. You're a grave robber, and in my army, grave robbers don't walk away." He turned to the MPs standing behind him, his orders crisp. "Take these tags to the chaplain. Have him record every name. I want these men identified, and I want their families notified that their loved ones were not forgotten." He gestured toward the SS guard, who was now staring at the ground, his previous arrogance utterly crushed. "And as for him, put him in the deepest holding cell you have. I don't want to see him." The MP grabbed the guard by the arm, and this time the man did not resist. He was led away, a pathetic shadow of the elite officer who had stood so tall minutes before. The yard remained frozen. The prisoners watched the general not with fear, but with a sudden, dawning respect. For the first time since their capture, they were seeing their enemy being held to a standard they had only ever heard of in the abstract. Patton turned back to the crowd of German POWs, his eyes sweeping over the rows of weary men. He wasn't just talking to the guard, he was talking to everyone. "War is a brutal business," he said, his voice carrying over the silence. "But honor is not a casualty of war. It is the only thing that separates us from the animals we fight. Remember that." He turned, his coat sweeping behind him as he marched toward the gate, leaving the camp in a state of stunned, silent reflection. The MP at the nearest table instinctively reached for his sidearm, but Patton raised a single, leather-gloved hand, ordering him to stand down without ever taking his eyes off the SS guard. The silence in the yard was absolute now. The ordinary German prisoners, who had been murmuring and shifting their weight just moments before, froze in their lines. They recognized the polished helmet and the ivory-handled revolvers of the American commander, but more than that, they recognized the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, dangerous plunge in temperature that occurs just before violence breaks loose. Patton stepped closer to the wire fence separating the command staff from the prisoners, his jaw set so tightly that the muscles twitched beneath his skin. "Where did you get those?" Patton asked. His voice was not a shout. It was low, raspy, and carried the quiet, lethal calm of a predator cornering its prey. The interpreter, standing nervously behind Patton, quickly translated the question into German. The SS guard stiffened, throwing his shoulders back in a display of practiced arrogance. He looked down at Patton and replied in German, a smirk barely concealed at the edge of his mouth. The interpreter hesitated for a fraction of a second, his face draining of color before translating the words back to Patton. "He says they are souvenirs, General, from the men his unit eliminated in the Ardennes." The word souvenirs hung in the cold spring air like a curse. To the SS guard, those 50 pieces of stamped metal were proof of his superiority, a personal ledger of American deaths collected from the snow-covered forests of the Bulge. But to Patton and to every American soldier standing in that yard, those tags were sacred. They were the identities, the bloodlines, and the final prayers of boys who had died in freezing foxholes. They were the small, metallic clinks that mothers prayed they would never have handed to them in a folded flag. The SS guard expected anger. He expected the American general to yell or order him beaten, which would only validate the guard's twisted sense of martyrdom. But Patton did not yell. He did not blink. The furious reaction inside the general was so profound that it bypassed rage and settled into a cold, merciless clarity. "Tell him," Patton said, his voice dropping another octave, sounding like stone grinding against stone, "that those tags belong to soldiers who fought and died with honor. A concept a butcher like him could never comprehend." The interpreter relayed the message, his voice trembling slightly. The SS guard's smirk faded, replaced by a rigid glare as he realized the psychological dynamic of the yard was shifting. He was no longer the intimidating victor flaunting his kills. He was being systematically dismantled in front of the very men he used to command. Patton took one final step toward the fence, closing the distance so completely that the guard could see the reflection of his own stolen trophies in the general's polished helmet. "And tell him," Patton continued, his eyes burning into the prisoner, "he has exactly 10 seconds to take them off, or I will have them cut from his neck." The guard's fingers, previously so steady as he held his rifle, stumbled over the clasp. It was a crude, heavy link, worn smooth by the friction of his own skin. He pulled at it, his face flushing deep red under the watchful gaze of hundreds of prisoners. When the clasp finally gave way, the string of metal rattled, a sickening, hollow sound that seemed to echo across the entire compound. The SS guard didn't drop it. He held it for a brief, defiant moment, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of a tag that belonged to a man he had killed months ago. Patton's eyes narrowed. He didn't wait for the guard to hand it over. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dirt, and snatched the necklace from the guard's hand with the speed of a striking cobra. The movement caused the guard to stumble backward, nearly tripping. Patton stood still, holding the heavy loop of chains and tags. He raised it, watching the sunlight glint off the stamped steel, the names and serial numbers of boys who would never go home, now reduced to a collection of scrap metal for a butcher to parade. Patton's face was a mask of cold fury, but as he ran his thumb over the first tag, his expression shifted into something more complex, a profound, heavy sorrow. He could read the names. They were boys whose units had been attached to his army. He looked at the SS guard, who was now trembling visibly, and the general's voice dropped to a whisper that was deadlier than a shout. "You think you're a soldier?" Patton asked, the question hanging in the air like a blade. "You're not a soldier. You're a grave robber. And in my army, grave robbers don't walk away." He turned to the MPs standing behind him, his orders crisp. "Take these tags to the chaplain. Have him record every name. I want these men identified, and I want their families notified that their loved ones were not forgotten." He gestured toward the SS guard, who was now staring at the ground, his previous arrogance utterly crushed. "And as for him, put him in the deepest holding cell you have. I don't want to see him." The MP grabbed the guard by the arm, and this time the man did not resist. He was led away, a pathetic shadow of the elite officer who had stood so tall minutes before. The yard remained frozen. The prisoners watched the general, not with fear, but with a sudden, dawning respect. For the first time since their capture, they were seeing their enemy being held to a standard they had only ever heard of in the abstract. Patton turned back to the crowd of German POWs, his eyes sweeping over the rows of weary men. He wasn't just talking to the guard, he was talking to everyone. "War is a brutal business," he said, his voice carrying over the silence. "But honor is not a casualty of war. It is the only thing that separates us from the animals we fight. Remember that." He turned, his coat sweeping behind him as he marched toward the gate, leaving the camp in a state of stunned, silent reflection. The heavy silence in the yard persisted long after the SS guard was dragged away by the MPs. Patton did not immediately depart, though his presence was already exerting a gravity that kept the entire enclosure tethered to the spot. He lingered by the wire, his eyes scanning the faces of the remaining German prisoners. The terror that had gripped the yard moments before was slowly dissolving, replaced by a strange, disoriented awe. They had witnessed something they believed to be impossible: the total dismantling of an SS officer's arrogance by an American general who treated the dignity of the fallen with more gravity than the status of the living. Patton's gaze finally settled on a young German corporal, a man who looked no older than 20, clutching his tin bowl so tightly his knuckles had blanched white. The boy seemed to be holding on to that bowl as if it were the only tether keeping him from collapsing into the mud. Patton stopped, his heavy boots making no sound in the damp earth. He looked at the corporal, then down at the meager ration, a thin, watery porridge, and finally back at the man's hollow, wide eyes. "You fight for a regime that treats you as nothing more than replaceable parts of a dying machine," Patton said. His voice was no longer the jagged edge of a blade. It was clinical, an observation of a failing system. But even in defeat, there is a choice. You can choose to be men who respect the dead, or you can continue to serve the remnants of a nightmare that has already abandoned you. The interpreter, standing a few paces back, translated the words. His voice was steady now, lacking the tremor from the confrontation, as if he too had been emboldened by the general's uncompromising stand. Patton did not wait for a reply. He was a master of the exit, fully aware that the weight of his departure would be just as impactful as the confrontation itself. He turned and marched toward the administration hut, his stride purposeful and rhythmic. Behind him, the camp began to wake up from its paralysis. The fear had not vanished, but the internal hierarchy that had ruled the prisoner compound was shattered. The ordinary soldiers began to exchange glances, looking at one another, then back to the empty space where the SS guard had been standing, the spot where the necklace of stolen American lives had finally been stripped away. The myth of the SS invincibility, which had been the backbone of their discipline, felt thin, fragile, and utterly devoid of meaning. Patton strode into the cramped administration hut, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him with a finality that seemed to seal the fate of everyone inside. The air in the hut was stale, smelling of tobacco smoke and damp paper, a sharp contrast to the biting fresh air of the yard. Captain Miller, the camp commander, was already waiting at the makeshift desk, his face pale, his hands resting on a stack of seized documents. He didn't speak. He simply gestured toward the desk where the small, leather-bound notebook, the one found in the SS guard's footlocker, lay open. Patton approached the desk slowly, his heavy boots sounding like drum beats on the creaky floorboards. He didn't sit. He leaned over the wood, his eyes scanning the cramped, hurried handwriting on the pages. "This isn't just a ledger of trades, General," Miller said, his voice barely audible over the faint sounds of the camp outside. "We started cross-referencing the names and dates. It's an itinerary." Patton flipped a page. The notebook was filled with coordinates, dates, and what appeared to be tallies. At first glance, they looked like inventory lists, but as he studied the margins, the context shifted. These were not just locations of battles. They were precise markers of transit points across the occupied territories of France and Belgium. Patton recognized the map references. They coincided with the retreat paths of the SS units that had been pushed back in the final months of the war. His heart, usually encased in a suit of impenetrable armor, felt the familiar, cold tightening of a hunter who has finally found the trail. "Cross-reference these with the missing person reports we pulled from the Red Cross files last week," Patton ordered, his voice devoid of emotion, though his eyes were alight with a terrifying intensity. If this guard was part of the unit that operated in these sectors during those exact dates, we aren't looking at a souvenir collector. We are looking at a witness to a slaughter. The captain nodded, already reaching for the radio to contact intelligence. Patton stood up, his gaze drifting to the window that looked out over the barbed wire, toward the barracks where the remaining SS officers were held under heavy guard. The realization was sinking in. The display of dog tags in the yard hadn't been an act of bravado. It was a confession. "Sir," Miller interrupted, his voice hesitant. "There is something else in the back of the notebook. It's not just dates. There's a list of names, not German names. These are American." Patton took the book again, his fingers tracing the ink. The names were written in a precise, block-letter German hand, but the phonetics were unmistakably American. 22 names, Miller said. "We've checked them against the casualty lists from the 101st Airborne. All 22 were reported missing, presumed killed in action during the final week of the Bulge." Patton went silent. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, heavier than any artillery barrage. They weren't just looking at war crimes, they were looking at a systematic erasure of history. Every tag that guard had worn represented a man whose death had been hidden, a life that had been turned into a ghost by the man currently sitting in a holding cell down the hall. Patton closed the notebook with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel striking a bench. The investigation had just moved from a matter of discipline to a matter of reckoning. The camp didn't sleep that night. It was an uneasy, restless silence. The news had traveled through the wire, filtered through the hushed conversations of prisoners who had spent months under the iron heel of the SS officers. For the first time, the hierarchy within the camp was inverted. The SS guard who had worn the necklace was gone, and the display of his defeat, the confiscated tags, had become a beacon of truth. In the small, dim office of the camp chaplain, the process of identifying the fallen began. The chaplain, a man with tired eyes and a soft voice, laid each tag out on the wooden desk. They were scratched, some bent from shrapnel, others caked in dried, dark soil. Each one was a life story. He didn't just see metal, he saw the boys who had been dragged away from their platoons, the ones who had vanished into the chaos of the retreat. Outside, the ordinary German prisoners, the ones who had been forced to share their rations and their dignity with the SS, felt a shift in the ground beneath them. They began to realize that the Americans were not merely occupiers who looked the other way. They were an army that operated under a code, one that Patton had just enforced with brutal, surgical precision. The fear that had kept them silent, the fear of their own officers, was eroding. A group of them, led by an older private who had served in North Africa, approached the administration hut. They weren't there to complain. They were there to offer information. One by one, they spoke of the secret caches, the hidden supply networks, and the names of the SS officers who had orchestrated the brutality. Patton, seated at his desk in the headquarters, listened to the reports filtering in through the night. The chaplain's list of names was growing. As the dawn broke, the camp was no longer a place of passive survival. It was a place where the truth was finally surfacing, bubble by bubble, out of the dark water. The SS officers, once the untouchable kings of the enclosure, now sat in their cells, their ears straining against the wall, listening to the sounds of their own authority crumbling. The justice Patton had initiated was not just a punishment for one man. It was the beginning of an avalanche. Every confession whispered to the MP guards was a nail in the coffin of the SS hierarchy that had held the camp hostage, and the general knew the real work had only just begun. The interrogation room was a makeshift tent at the edge of the perimeter, lit by a single, flickering lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against the canvas walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and old sweat. Patton entered without ceremony, the flaps of the tent slapping shut behind him with the sound of a pistol shot. The SS guard was slumped in a wooden chair, his hands zip-tied behind his back, his posture no longer the rigid, defiant stance he had held in the yard. He was breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the muddy floor, refusing to meet the gaze of the two MPs flanking him. Patton walked around the chair, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the leather of his boots squeaking softly in the quiet. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply let the guard sit in the suffocating silence, letting the man's own mind fill the void with the dread of what was coming. "The chaplain is finished," Patton said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. He stopped behind the guard, staring down at the man's shaven head. "He's accounted for every tag. 22 of them. That means 22 American families have been waiting for news that their sons aren't coming home, news you held in your hand like a trinket." The guard flinched. He tried to open his mouth, perhaps to spout the usual rhetoric about following orders or the glory of the fatherland. But Patton stepped in front of him, leaning down so their noses were inches apart. The sheer force of the general's personality seemed to pin the guard to the seat. "Do not give me excuses," Patton spat, the restraint in his voice finally fracturing. "There is no ideology on this earth that makes a man a scavenger. You aren't a soldier, you are a parasite." Patton straightened up and reached into his pocket, pulling out one of the dog tags he had taken earlier. He dangled it in front of the guard's eyes. It swung rhythmically, a pendulum of judgment. "Do you see this? This belongs to a boy from Ohio. He was 19. He didn't die for your cause or your twisted vision of a master race. He died because he was a man who stood in your way." Patton's eyes were cold, unyielding. "I don't care about your rank, your unit, or who you think you are. You are going to tell me exactly how he died, every detail. And if I find out you're lying, I'll see to it that your end is far less dignified than the men you murdered." The guard finally looked up. For the first time, the facade of the SS fanatic broke completely. He saw the abyss in Patton's eyes, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had decided that, for the sake of the dead, he would become the hand of their vengeance. The guard began to shake, his lips parting to speak, the dam finally breaking. The days that followed in the camp were marked by a silence that was less about fear and more about reflection. The chaplain worked tirelessly in his small, dim office, his desk buried under piles of official military correspondence. Through the intricate machinery of the U.S. Army's logistics, packages were prepared, addressed, and sent across the Atlantic. Each package contained a small piece of stamped steel, cleaned of its battlefield mud, and a letter, not from Patton, but from the chaplain, written under his explicit orders. The letters were simple and devoid of the grand, hollow rhetoric often found in military correspondence. They spoke of honor, of sacrifice, and of the cold, hard fact that their loved ones had never been truly lost. They were found. Patton never returned to the camp. He was a man of the front lines, and by the time the chaplain began mailing those packages, the general was already pushing his divisions deep into the crumbling heart of Germany. But his mark was already etched into the foundations of the compound. The story of the necklace and the general's icy fury became a quiet legend passed between units as they moved through the devastated countryside. It was a story that served as a grim reminder that even in the absolute moral bankruptcy of total war, there were lines that could not be crossed without consequence. The SS guard who had worn the necklace disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of post-war justice, his name fading into the black and white archives of forgotten war criminals. But the 50 men whose names were stamped into those pieces of steel, they were reclaimed. Most people know how World War II ended. They remember the maps, the treaties, the grand speeches of victory, and the lines of history drawn in ink. Very few know about the small, quiet acts of justice that occurred in the shadows of the collapsing Third Reich. The moments where humanity, for a fleeting heartbeat, reasserted its claim on the world. History books talk about divisions and airstrikes. They rarely talk about the general who stopped his march to stare down a butcher, or the day 50 ghost soldiers finally came home to the hands that had prayed for them. It was a victory measured not in territory gained, but in the restoration of a name. For the families who finally held those dog tags in their trembling hands, it was the only victory that mattered. The war was over, but the duty to the dead remained, and as long as a soldier's name was remembered, the sacrifice they made was never truly lost to the silence.